You all to this session of Crossroads of Conversation. Crossroads of ConveRVsation is a forum initiated by RV College of Architecture to involve alumni across the globe with the current college scenarios and to be a part of various discussions and exchange of ideas. The year of 2020 has been challenging, and the emergence of collaborative practices seem to be the way forward. The need of the hour is to diversify and combine strategies from a spectrum of other disciplines related to the field of architecture. Given the current situation of the global pandemic, COVID 19, we are at RVCA see the need to engage with the larger worldview that has an influence on the field of architecture. As a step in this direction, we are proposing to organize webinars for the ongoing semester exploring the relevance of other disciplines on architectural design titled Crossroads of ConveRVsation 2020. The webinar enables the exchange of ideas and work experience from other allied fields between domain experts and alumni of RVCA who are currently spread across the globe. From politics of development at the urban scale to various forms of art and design, an explorative journey of how, where other disciplines intersect and connect with architecture and architects is the main idea of Crossroads of ConveRVsation 2020. So, the topic for today's event is tracing narratives. We are joined by actor, filmmaker, poet, storyteller, puppet maker, and puppeteer PADMAVATI RAO,
Yes.
architect and RV alumnus SUNIL Dev Prasanna, and architect, visual designer, and RV alumnus NEETI SIVAKUMAR. Discussion will be moderated at the end by architect and RV alumnus MEERA VASUDEV, and the question and answer session will be held at the end.
Now, we'd like to introduce our first speaker, Padmavati Rao. She is an actor, writer, director, translator, and poet. She speaks many languages but prefers writing in Hindi. As an actor, she's worked in Kannada, Hindi, English, Marathi, and now even Malayalam and Tamil cinema. The Hindi films she's acted are Pardes, Teen, Padmavat, Tanhaji, and Ratakiri. Here, she's also translated plays of Girish Karnad and Mahesh Dattani into Hindi. Padmavati Rao is also a storyteller and puppeteer. A collection of poems, Kuch Pyar, Kuch Tadap, of love and longing, was released by Girish Karnad at the Bangalore Poetry Festival in 2017. She's worked with Girish Karnad in various capacities for 42 years as an actor, director, and a dialogue writer and translator. She's also translated Kiran Nagarkar's Kakul, trained in the process work as a facilitator at the Foundation for Human Learning and Growth. She combines process work and theatre in her work with children and adults. She trains teachers to use theatre in the classroom and has worked with them in private and government schools from around the country, in Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, and even in Lakshadweep and communities in Himalayas to empower them to tell their own stories to a larger audience. She's conducted workshops abroad as well. She hopes to make theatre more accessible to people of various age groups and across geographies. These days, her focus has been on villages outside Bangalore, where she endeavors to do and promote more natural farming, arts, and crafts. Her TEDx talk on the subject of including all that is immeasurable in life, especially in schools, are now on YouTube. Her interest in natural farming, arts, and crafts drives her to stay connected and build bridges between people and cultures. Thank you, ma'am, for taking your time out to be here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So, yeah, here we go. I was wondering, actually, I'll be honest, I was wondering what am I going to talk about to architects who already know how to construct and build and, create structures. And I'm someone who's breaking away from structure all the time. I think in theater as actors, there's that much you can confine us, and that's what makes an actor. That's what makes an artist. And so I think my invitation to each one of you is to look at how you can find the artist within. Yes, you are architects, but how do we find the artist within? What is that story we'd like to find within us? And therefore, I'll start with my own story. In my childhood, I mean, I was born in Delhi. And as a child, I've spent only the first 3 years of my life in Delhi. But there's one very strong visual, which is of the house where we lived. And the most strong visual of that time is the garden. The garden, a wicket gate, the kitchen garden at the back, and the steps in the front of the veranda. And that architecture stands out every time I think of that period of time. Then when I was 4, we came to Bombay. I was in a flat. And it had a big balcony. And I have memories of my father teaching me to skip in that balcony. In today's day and age, I find that most buildings don't have balconies. If at all they do, there's some tokenism that's offered to the people who occupy the house and their visitors in terms of a balcony. And then after that, I grew up in a place called Santa Cruz West, in a lane called Green Street. And I think all of these little things have mattered in my life. The fact that that lane was called Green Street, I don't know why it was called Green Street, but yes, we did have some amount of greenery. But by then the high rise in Bombay had begun. And I had the misfortune in my growing years as a teenager of seeing friends' houses give way, independent houses give way to multi-storied buildings. Unfortunately, I'm witnessing that later in my life in Bangalore also. Another memory is of my grandmother's house, which was in an eastern suburb of Santa Cruz. And it was a house with tiled roof. And that I loved climbing on that tiled roof. And of course, everyone in the house would be, my mother would be worried, but my grandmother wasn't worried. She would say, yeah, of course, if she doesn't do it now, when is she going to do it? And I'm so grateful for that, for just having been allowed to walk on a tiled roof as a child. My grandmother's house, my aunt's house in the same vicinity had a backyard where there were trees growing. There were coconut trees, there was tur dal growing, there was all sorts of things which would be harvested. And when I look back, I think all of that has influenced me tremendously in terms of my idea of beauty. And I think that is something we need to look at, because the idea of beauty, I think, persists. It has long and far-reaching consequences. If you bring up a child, if you tell a child that red is red and peach colored, something that is peach colored is also red, the child believes you and grows up with that notion. And then sometimes there is blindness to that until someone comes along and discovers that, okay, this person is calling peach also red, or at best orange. How does the idea of beauty manifest itself for us in the nuances of our perception? I think that is something we really need to pay attention to, because it pervades the idea of utility, this idea of beauty. Because today when I look around me and I look at the buildings around me, I see some buildings which call themselves eco-friendly are more about cladding. Where is the philosophy? If I want to truly live out a philosophy that I believe in. So today I can say very firmly that I believe in naturalism, in natural farming, for example. Last 7 years, it's been an uphill task for me to just say that we're going to do nothing with the land. We're just going to let it be, right? Nature has her own way of shaping herself. and us. And can we get more sensitive to that? That is an idea I have been trying to incorporate in my life and look at the least intervention that I need to make or must make. And believe me, it has worked beautifully in a way, because every time I find that I'm surprised by what nature can just work out for me. And it is more of a disappointment when I have to work with man-made structures. For example, I have insisted on a house with mud and lime. Today, neither can I get workers because the traditional knowledge system itself is fading away. That has happened willy-nilly. On the other hand, there's a willful disengagement with it. There are those people who know how to build, but there is a younger generation that doesn't want to indulge in it. The third thing is it's extremely expensive, as I'm discovering. And I'm also finding that I'm probably not going to be able to build this. This would probably be the last home I ever build in my life, because it can be a nightmare. And I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I've sort of stuck my heels in the ground on it. And so I'm sitting with a foundation and no walls and nothing. So what I'm trying to say is that how do we adopt philosophy that we believe in? What is that has influenced me? If I look at storytelling, because I am a storyteller, I am a theater person, and if I look at these things, and this is the way I've dealt with the rest of my life also, that what is it that I believe in? What is the philosophy I want to live by? How do I go about it? What are the sacrifices I'll have to make? What is the price I'm going to have to pay for it? You know, sometimes there's a very dear truth that may not have sanction that might not have social sanction, shall we say. But it's very dear. And sometimes to guard it, to protect it, you end up embracing several untruths. So my invitation to everyone is that what is that truth which I hold very dear and which I hold as precious, which I want to nurture but cannot, simply because it would mean going against the tide. But what is it I truly believe in? Can I look at that? Can I hang on to it? Can I actually also develop my philosophy from that belief? Can I stick by it? And what is the story I want to tell? Today, my story is that I want to be able to say that, you know, this is how it used to be. For example, yesterday somebody sent me a forward. It's a house with a copper pillar in the center of the house. It's an old house. In my village, there are a lot of houses with what is called the totti mane. And I wish I could afford building one of those, but I can't, so I'm just going to build part of it. But what about the courtyards that we used to have? Those places where we could actually bond together, sit under the stars. Or in Delhi, I remember we used to sleep out on the lawn on khatiyas. Khatiyas are just cots which are woven with rope. And I have memories of my father showing me the night sky, and the Sputnik was there then. And he was pointing it out to me. Now, that is the sort of experience I want to immortalize, maybe. I want to pass on to the next generation. I want to be able to share that experience. I know I'll never be able to take everybody with me on a picnic, but I remember us going on picnics through my childhood. And today, if you want to go for a picnic, my God, you have to go so far away. And there are no guarantees of finding a beautiful spot where you won't be disturbed. And I really pity youngsters these days, because as young people in love, there are no places. That architecture is not just about building closed structures. It's also about building openness into our surroundings. And I think we need to look at the needs and wants of not just any particular section of society, but as people from different generations, from different backgrounds, people who carry different stories. And I have a quote from Steven Spielberg. It says, the most amazing thing for me is that every single person who sees a movie, not necessarily one of my movies, brings a whole set of unique experiences. But through careful manipulation and good storytelling, you can get everybody to clap at the same time and to be afraid at the same time. That's Spielberg's quote. And there's another author who says, I'll tell you a secret. Old storytellers never die. They disappear into their own story. So my invitation to you is create that story that you would love to disappear into as I create mine. And I hope someday all of you here who are on this webinar might find it worthy to join me on the journey that I'm on. You are all welcome. Do reach out to me. You can get my number from Ms. Salila Vanka. And yes, I hope I've made some sort of sense. I don't know if I've made a dent, but I do hope you will hang on to some of the things that I've mentioned and see if you can incorporate it. And of course, you're welcome to join me, like I said, on the journey. And if you have questions, please put them on the chat and I'll answer them. Thank you so much. So was that 15 minutes?
It fell shorter, Padmavati. Your story could have gone on. But yeah, thank you so much. That's lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was really insightful and interesting. I would like to thank you again for taking out your time and doing this for us. So
Thank
now
you.
I would like to introduce our next speaker for the day, Sunil Dev Prasanna. Sunil Dev Prasanna did his Bachelor's of Architecture at RVCE. He has 13 years of practical experience in architecture, primarily on urban design projects for the Tourism Department and Water Resource Department of the Karnataka government. Through these government bodies, Sunil has worked on several projects to promote ecotourism in Karnataka. Since 2015, Sunil has branched out into the field of historical miniature modeling, primarily focusing on the tabletop gaming industry. His company, iBuild, has pioneered the use of glueless and toolless assembly with model kits that are super modular in their design, allowing multiple kits to be combined in an almost unlimited fashion. iBuild launched a Kickstarter campaign in the month of October for their medieval range of model kits that raised a total of 92,000 US dollars to date. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi guys, I finished my bachelor's back in 2007 and somehow it didn't seem that long ago until you all just mentioned the date. So I've been practicing architecture for close to 13 years now. But back in 2015, I introduced another vertical into my company where we basically design model kits for the tabletop gaming industry. So tabletop gamers are basically a group of hobbyists who basically meet together to simulate historical battles in miniature. So what they do is they set up entire medieval towns, not just medieval, but basically any time period. They set up these entire towns and castles, and then they spend weeks playing these games using miniature figures, and they basically use dice to decide the outcome of the game. So I'm going to start off by just showing you a quick intro video we did for the Kickstarter campaign we launched in October. Just hang on a second. So this video will basically give you an introduction into what it is we do. It'll also give you the details of what we do.
Welcome to the wonderful world of I Built It architectural miniatures. We have spent the past 5 years perfecting our unique model making system. Designed by engineer architect team Zoya and Sunil, partners in both life as well as work. They have more than a decade of professional experience between them. It was their shared love for history and scale modeling that brought them together to form I Built It. They have poured their engineering expertise, extensive architectural and historical knowledge, and a passion for craftsmanship into creating the world of I Built It. Our kits are historically authentic and are filled with realistic architectural and structural details both inside and out. Our kits are designed to be super modular, allowing you to combine them together in an almost unlimited fashion, giving you the ability to create entire towns and castles, your only limit being your imagination. Our unique super modular system allows you to stack every module vertically as well as horizontally in any direction. We use a system where wooden pegs are used to join modules together, allowing you to create structural features such as vaults, bridges, and buttresses. You can interchange facades to create multiple material combinations, giving you the flexibility to create your own unique style. Our facade grid allows you to install a wide variety of architectural features, such as balconies, hoardings, signage, bay windows, turrets, and a whole lot more. All our kits come with their parts flat packed for your convenience. Each part is clearly numbered, keeping in mind the assembly sequence, making it easy to locate parts at a glance. To separate a part from its frame, all you need to do is twist. There is no need to use any kind of tool. To build your own medieval setting, you can use kits from our Town series and Castle series. You can then use our fully functional Siege engine kits to attack them. Our entire system works using a unique friction fit technique where you just clip parts together. Listen for that satisfying click sound as you join one part to another. To build an I Built It kit, all you need are your 2 hands. No tools, glue, or paint required. Our building kits come with 2 options to represent stone: regular texture and pro texture, for those who wish to take their model to the next level of realism. Add custom weathering to elevate your model to the next level. You can even replicate battle damage by cutting parts away to expose the authentic structure beneath. And even though every set is designed for extreme modularity, they still retain their own unique architectural character. We use only the finest raw materials, certified to ensure your safety. Precision cut on machines calibrated for high accuracy. At I Built It, it is our dream to make this amazing hobby affordable and accessible to everyone, without compromising even slightly on the detail and functionality. Our medieval series of 28mm models are fully tested and ready for production, but we need your help to make it available to everyone. Consider partnering with us to make this campaign a success.
Hello. I'm not sure if I can be heard right now.
Yes, you are. You are audible.
Okay, and I don't know if any audio played as well because
Yeah,
I couldn't hear any feedback.
It did. We saw the entire video and it was good.
Okay, great. So basically, when we started back in 2015, we had actually come up with an entire game plan. So we knew exactly what we were going to do. We knew right from the beginning that we were going to focus on the medieval time period. This was basically because the documentation to get the architectural details right was very easily accessible. It was just a click away. We were actually very keen to do the Japanese style, but many of the architectural details were extremely difficult to access, and it was not properly documented. So the medieval theme is also the most popular. So it was an economic decision basically also to stick with medieval theme. Now the problem is, even though we had a solid game plan, between 2015 and 2020, we kind of lost our way. We had decided initially that we wanted our models to be modular, but we completely forgot about that during the implementation process. So the first 3 years were spent designing model sets that were not fully modular. So while it did sell, very much later on in our design process, we encountered our earlier notes. And then we were like, how did we forget to make it modular? So just about 6 months before we did our Kickstarter campaign, we overhauled our entire design to implement the what do you call it, the modular system work. So even our modular system right now has multiple layers. So layer number one would basically be where each modular block measures about 100 mm by 100 mm, and you can stack them both vertically as well as horizontally. The layer two for the modularity would basically be the architectural accessories. Hang on, I think it'll be great if I can demonstrate some of this. Yeah. So this was one of our very early models, but the texture that you see right now was something we developed very later on. Initially, it was this very simplified vector line kind of engraving. So the accessories, architectural accessories, come in multiple varieties. We have balconies, we have bay windows, we have signage, and all of these basically interlock with grids that are all over the model surface. And this is therefore all our sets. Then the third layer of the modularity is where the facades can basically be interchanged. So you can take the facade off of any set and put it on any other set. So you can actually mix up combinations like brick, wood, stone. So the point here is it gives the end user the ability to make almost anything they want with very little limitations. So in terms of storytelling, every one of our sets has a little story embedded into it. And that kind of gives the end user a narrative on which to build their own story onto. Because ultimately, when people play tabletop games, they are basically trying to tell their own story. They shoot videos, they discuss strategies, and it forms a very strong community. And we have found that the community has been extremely receptive to our products because we only launched it about, I would say, 6 months ago. So we basically spent about 4.5 months on just developing the product. And it was quite a journey because it took us a long time to basically figure out what type of material we want to use. Because initially we were thrilled when we discovered this local Indian material, which was extremely cheap to source. But once we got it tested and sampled, we realized that no European Union or actually basically any other country outside India would accept it because it did not meet certain norms and standards for emissions. So we basically lost about 6 months worth of work because of that material choice. Then when it came to the paint, that took us, so basically every aspect of design took us close to 6 months to a year to nail down and get right. So the first was the material, second was the choice of paint. We again spent 6 months selecting different types of paint, trying to ensure it met the stringent international standards. The problem was the moment we finalized our samples And when we went back to get bulk quantity for production, we realized that the place we were sourcing from was not an accredited agency of the company. So the colors that they were giving us were completely random. So we had to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch to get our colors right. Then later on, our friction, we were very sure that we wanted our sets to be built without using any kind of glue, because this would what would basically differentiate us from all our competitors out there. Because we are the only company currently in the entire world that has modular sets that are completely toolless and glueless in their assembly. So to get the friction fit system working took us close to a year, because initially we would have success rates of about 30%, which means that out of 10 friction fit joints, only 3 would actually work. The remaining 7 would either be too loose or too tight. And it took multiple tests and repeated experimentation until finally it was like a eureka idea that hit us. And we worked out this system that we have now patented. And it basically allows you to friction fit pieces of wood together with a close to 95% success rate. So we still have about 5% that fails. Then it took us another 6 months or so to basically work out our mechanical systems to get it working. So currently we have about 12 SKUs or 12 different model types. And each model type took close to about 6 to 7 months of work to get finalized. Then the lockdown came. Once we were finally ready to hit the market, we took part in this exhibition in Nuremberg. It's the biggest toy fair in the world. And we actually picked up a lot of customers there. The problem was the moment we got back to India to process these orders, the coronavirus took over and the lockdown hit us. And we ended up losing a lot of those orders. And we almost went under because of that. But luckily, during the lockdown, we started working on our Kickstarter campaign. We managed to shoot the video under lockdown conditions with no staff. And yeah, basically all our staff was working online, work from home. So we managed to wrap up the video shooting plus all the preparation for the Kickstarter campaign by October. And when we launched it, we had a pretty phenomenal response. We met our target in about 40 minutes of launching our campaign. And we went on to exceed our, basically the goal we set. To date, we have raised about 95,000 US dollars. And that Kickstarter campaign basically saved our company. And we have now been able to expand our production, and we're basically running 3 shifts a day now, 24/7 we are operating. I'm just going to share another screen of the website. Yeah. So this is our Kickstarter page. So basically with the Kickstarter campaign, to incentivize backers to spend more, we basically have something called stretch goals, where we tell them that for every level, financial level that we unlock, you will basically get these items for free. We also use social media marketing quite heavily. We sent a lot of our products to video influencers who ran videos for us, and that brought in a lot of our traffic. But the single biggest source of revenue was this guy in Poland named Pikasawi. So he has an Instagram channel, and he basically took our sets and he weathered it. So weathering is a process where you artificially apply age. You add basically stains, you add plants, you add moss, and this makes the buildings look more realistic. About 2 months before we launched our campaign, we developed a new system called what we call Pro Texture. So initially, we were basically vector engraving the masonry lines. They looked very simple. It was just painted MDF with the score lines on it. But we discovered this new technique where you could actually superimpose a photograph in 3 dimensions onto the surface of the MDF. And the laser would basically selectively burn away material and create this realistic stone texture. Yeah, so we basically ran our campaign for about 30 days. We had our ups and downs during the campaign because we had a lot of buyers who had buyer regret and they ended up pulling their funds. And we would basically see the graph go down and then climb again and then go down and then climb again. So the entire campaign was quite a nerve-wracking experience. So the thing is, with each of our sets, even though they are all fully modular, each set has its own architectural characteristic that is very unique to it. And this basically blends into the storytelling capability of each set. So if I have more time, I'm just going to read out one of the stories for you from one of the sets a little later on. As you can see, each set is basically detachable. You can lift up each floor level. You can open up the roofs to look inside. You can place furniture. Even the furniture is modular, so you can place it in any orientation you want by clipping it to these little sockets we have in the floor plate. Yeah. So just give me just 1 second. I'm going to share the story with you all. Am I still audible?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Because there's no feedback, so I'm not able to make out.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So this is basically one of our instruction manuals. It is extremely comprehensive. We have basically tested our sets close to 100 times to look for potential pitfalls that people will actually struggle with as they assemble our models. And based on that, we have developed the instruction manual. And we've also included a short story here that each person basically uses to build their tabletop game. So I'm going to read it out for you. It's a very short, quick story. And it has a medieval setting. So just bear with me for 2 minutes. The mules snorted impatiently in the cold darkness. The shipment of fine flour was due for the Lord's feast, but the gates only opened at dawn, and the queue was long. The master cook would not be pleased with the delay. Chains suddenly rattled, and the door creaked upwards. The main doors burst open, and the king's guard thundered past on their war horses, their hoofs battering the timbers of the drawbridge. Make way, they shouted, but it was too late. With a crash, the lead horse smashed into the mule cart, and all that fine flour went into the moat with a resounding splash. There would be no bread for the Lord's feast. So the point of these stories is it's basically a starting point for the gamers to start their campaign with. So they will basically reenact all the stories mentioned in each of these booklets, and from there they branch out, and then they generate their own stories, and then they compile these stories and they send it back to us. So it's quite an interactive experience, this entire process of designing models and selling it to people. Yeah. So I think that's basically it. Have I taken up too much time?
No, I think it was absolutely within the time limits. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. That was very interesting. I would now like to call our next speaker.
Padmavati, Sunil Padmavati wrote saying, I would love to work towards making this available to kids in my village. So, sorry, Namrata, I butted in.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'd be happy to work with her.
Yeah.
Which village is Padmavati from? I think she's
Padmavati,
muted.
you're muted.
It's 80 kilometers from Bangalore.
What's it called?
It's called Duntur. It's
Okay.
near Satnur. But yeah, we could take that offline. And
Yeah, sure, sure.
because I think what you're doing has a lot of potential. And this whole thing that I was talking about in terms of the idea of beauty, you know, if you come to my village, it's a very beautiful village, but its face is changing. And they're going in for cement and asbestos, and the beauty itself is vanishing. And because we don't take pride in our architecture anymore.
Yes, I agree with that completely.
And I think we look at the models you've made. I mean, they're a celebration of European architecture. And I think Indian architecture needs to be celebrated. And if we can collaborate on that, that would be fantastic.
No, so we actually want to have a series on Indian architecture. The main problem we faced was the demand was initially not there because we needed to do a lot of educating in our Indian market.
Yeah, more than
I'm sure.
More than education, you know, Sunil, I think we lost our sense of pride. And I think we need to reinstill that sense of pride. We don't need to teach, really. We just need to get proud again of the things that we did have. And we had a lot.
True.
We had a lot. We still
Yeah,
do. We still do. We just need to learn how to celebrate it.
Yeah.
So I hope we can do that together someday.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be in touch.
Sure, please.
After the seminar is done.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would introduce our next speaker now. Our next speaker is NEETI SIVAKUMAR. She is an RV alumnus, architect and visual designer. She works with histories of cities and narrative architecture through mediums like graphic novels, animation, and other visual imageries. She's worked for the Kochi Muziris Biennale and participated in various workshops conducted by the Kosovo Architecture Festival, City Labs Writing Urban History, and Non-School. She's currently working on a children's book that describes the architecture of a library. Thank you, ma'am, for being here today.
So I'm going to share my screen. My video is separated from my audio, so please excuse that. So my presentation is quite lengthy, I think, and expansive. So I apologize for that. So I've always had a hard time defining the projects that I was working on. I'd like to think of myself as something like a paper architect. Of course, there has been a lot of back and forth about who actually is an architect, but the term paper architect refers to architects that work on utopian, dystopian, and fantasy projects. It was the name of a group in Russia, I think, and includes a collection of projects by architects and artists in dissent. The idea that I could be an architect without actually needing to go into practice quite excited me because I'm a huge fan of speculation and speculative projects. I currently work as a freelance graphic designer and dabble sometimes in animation and illustration. And it's been very interesting to see where architecture actually plays a role in other forms of media, like even in the background of music videos, in gaming, novels, and so on. So briefly breaking down this presentation, I've looked at narratives in different categories, and I've actually put in some of my inspiration before getting into the projects that I've worked on over the last year. So to start with, I'm going to talk about an approach I take to my projects. It's been hard working with different mediums, and what you convey through text is quite different from what you convey through drawing, through sound, through animation, and so on. So storyboarding is a really great tool that I'd like to think has a hand in all design fields. It's basically a visual layout of your narrative. It organizes your key scenes, which is architecture or otherwise, in order to understand key aspects of your story. It's pretty similar to how storyboarding is done. Actually, it is exactly how storyboarding is done in films and animation. So once you figure out your key frames, you can kind of start layering more information, which is stuff like your dialogue, transitions, timing, sound, and whatever else you need to tell your story. So you don't need to worry much here because this is just a representative image. This is actually a project that I'll be explaining later on in the presentation if you were trying to read what was on screen. Okay, so I've categorized some stuff I've read about narratives and the different ways I've looked at them. Of course, a lot of this actually stems from architecture. So in the last few years, there have been a number of projects and competitions that revolve around storytelling. And I think one of the first of these that I found was Fairy Tales in Architecture by Project Blank Space. And this is quite interesting because they basically take, the competitors take existing or self-made narratives and use that as a method to designing. And I think it's way more common now. A lot of thesis projects, especially, talk about fiction and architecture. And of course, we all know the typical books that have usually been referenced to us over the course of college, which is Invisible Cities. But books like Invisible Cities, Invisible Libraries, and books by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie, which is under magical realism, a lot of this are great inspiration for spatial narratives, especially. So while Invisible Cities and Libraries delve into the experience of space, magical realism creates a fantastical setting where events have no logical or psychological explanation. And this puts a lot of emphasis on the context that space creates. And overall, I think a lot of this talks about translating between mediums. So from text, from movies, a lot of this you can use within design methodologies. So some inspiration that I felt reflects this is a studio in LA called Bureau Spectacular. They make graphics, models, and even graphic novels on architecture. They view architecture itself as a medium that is capable of rewriting cultural narratives. So what you see to the left, that's the cover for their graphic novel, No Citizens of No Place. It's mostly about architecture theory and how subjective it is. The work that you see to the right is a project that is called Inside, Outside, Between, and Beyond. It basically comprises 5 models, and they basically take on typical structures that you see in the environment today, and they critically look at these things. So they call them something like monuments of civilization. So things like skyscrapers, the apartment complex. Okay, so moving into the next topic, I did want to mention that these topics definitely overlap. There's all of the examples that I've mentioned don't necessarily fall just under one category. Under this, I wanted to delve more into writing and its relationship with design and history. So sight writing is actually a term coined by a professor from Bartlett, Jane Randall, where it's a developed practice where the writer reflects their own subjective position in relation to whatever they're studying. It's the process of putting together remembered histories of a site, your current relationship with it, and even some aspects of your imagination within this context. Quite similar to this is pictocriticism. It's something like science fiction, where it's a mix of fiction, criticism, architecture, urban design, cities, things like that. And it's more or less a commentary on the current scenario. I think it's a big reflection on various disciplines because it takes in your culture, your geography, and various other studies, actually. And while they may be speculative, they're really usually realistic scenarios that are based on solid facts. The studio that I thought reflected this the most is called Design Earth. The image that you see to the left is pretty much what I was talking about, the idea of using fiction, but a lot of their projects actually go well within deep into research, backing their projects. So the project that you see to the right is, I think, one of their biggest projects that's called After Oil, which basically studies the infrastructure surrounding oil itself. It talks mostly about sites of extraction, points of transit, and environmental disasters. They do a brief study into the idea of progress that is usually attached to such infrastructure, and the fact that a lot of people don't know the actual energy that is put into building such structures. I think it's also worth mentioning that these forms that they create, I mean, these drawings and the models that you saw by Bureau Spectacular, they're actually considered contemporary art and is, I think, taken into the collection with the MoMA in San Francisco. Okay, here I wanted to talk about narratives in more of an exploratory medium, like AR, VR, comics, animations, installations. So AR, VR is quite popular now. A lot of exhibitions have actually moved to this thanks to COVID. And even the Serendipity Arts Festival, I think, was held online. So the built environment here really takes on a bigger role than it used to. It's no longer a backdrop and proves to be quite interactive. And this is especially since VR uses both physical and digital space. A project that I found quite interesting that's called Architects Admit. It's the image to the left. You can actually access this online in case you're interested. It's basically a confession room where architects go to confess their environmental sins. And I think this is quite interesting because since it was initially developed as a physical installation, but later on it's on a VR platform now. And another project that you see to the right is by Forensic Architecture, a multidisciplinary architecture studio that develops scenes to do with existing sites of conflict. So they depict the scenario as well as the context it occurs in. Now, I think this is one of my favorite studios. Studio Oleomingus is a gaming studio in Chennai. They work with post-colonial narratives. And I think the use of such graphics really takes a spin on what we look at history as. So they basically try to make histories more absurd, and they try to remove the authority that it is initially told with. The project that you see to the right is called In the Pause Between the Ringing. It is basically a fiction about a fictional Gujarati poet. And it really takes us to various different landscapes, as you can see. The story reads as various telephonic conversations, kind of a representation of how telephone wires cross territorial boundaries. The project that to your left is actually still available. Actually, all of their projects are available online. The one to the left is what they showed at the Serendipity Arts Festival this year. So finally, I'm going to get into some of my projects. So yeah, this project revolved around protest and architecture. To begin with, zines are really the best way to make information more accessible since they're really easily distributable. The zine culture came up in the 1970s and is making a comeback now. And since it comes under the typical punk DIY culture, the imagery is really flexible and monochrome so as to make it easy to replicate. So zines especially have had a great relationship with protesting. An artist whose work that you see to the right, she developed some images and printed them out in order to protest during the Vietnamese War. And of course, this was before the zine culture, but I really think it feeds into the imagery that is kind of anti-establishment. Of course, to the left, the images are familiar. They're archigrams, graphics. So this is the project that I developed from this. It's called The Shrine for the Menstruator. And it really took on the context of the Sabrimala temple. And I think taking this topic up created a story in its own, moving from the typical representation of women in pop culture all the way to the history of the temple as we know it, and even ended with a makeshift architectural intervention. But what I did was I made use of the Renaissance Indian paintings that specifically Raja Ravi Varma painted to give the project context for women figures in mythology. And of course, various stories in Hindu mythology really help question the perspectives on women. Okay, so This is another project that I worked on during a workshop with a studio called Animali Domestici. They're now located in Denmark, I think. And it started off as a reading of the city from the point of view of critters. Depending on the landscape that the participants chose, they had to pick specific species to work with. And I personally chose urban birds and the built environment. I thought the first exercise that we did was kind of cool. It's basically 3D mapping. So we used a software called Agisoft, and we went around the city looking for spaces that we thought our species really existed in, more or less. Sorry. Okay, so this was basically our end result. It was a model world in VR on the platform Sansar. And my intervention was more or less extensions of streetlights and electric poles, and wherein they became trees themselves. They were made of edible material, and this kind of allowed the infrastructure to deteriorate naturally, something which we don't see in the built environment. I mean, of course, we do see it deteriorate, but it's a lot of the time whitewashed. And this also gave a safer perching spot for birds. Okay, in this project, I worked with comics primarily. The reason why I put in these 3 images is because I wanted to show how different comics can look and feel based on the narrative itself. So the first comic is from a Superman comic, the second is by the artist Chris Ware, and the third is my personal favorite by Deborah Lee. So I think the first style is quite popular. Even Archigram used it to style some of their graphics. And this is the outcome. The project itself talks about the history of Chennai through the lens of urban nomenclature. It maps the series of changes in city, town, and street names within Chennai, but also it relates to the changes that have been made across the country, especially recently. And I personally thought the comic was the best form of representation because I thought it could relay underlying messages based on the events that I referred to in the text itself. And finally, the last project that I'll be presenting is a collage animation. This is also formed during a workshop that was conducted by the Kosovo Architecture Festival. So basically, the workshop itself was quite interesting. We all worked in isolation. There was no contact until the last day. And basically what happened was the workshop leaders gave us tasks separately and some form of submissions that other players had created. And it was hard to depict the intention of another architect, honestly, to work with data that, well, you don't know where it comes from. And especially since this was a foreign context, it became hard to develop ideas of my own because I come from a different background. But that was the intention of the workshop. The participants basically wrote out a written narrative. We had a line drawing that tried to reframe the hotel itself in terms of the scenes that take place within a hotel. Someone else who put together dialogue from movies about hotels, common sounds in hotels, and so on. I'll play you a bit of the video, but I think this presentation's been pretty long, so I will cut that short. So this was the line drawing reframing the actual image. The video itself we made in one day, I think, using After Effects. So a lot of it became choppy. So to give you more context about the project itself, it was based in a hotel that is located in Kosovo, and it talks the hotel itself has a lot of the history that you see about the country. There is a lot going on with the previous dictators that had rule, and with this sordid past, the government has had a hard time actually selling the property. So the intent of the workshop, while this video was one outcome, the other was to see how one can open up a hotel. And in that, we delved into the repetitive and private nature of hotel rooms. And in order to make it a temporary exhibition space, we broke down walls of the bathroom, the most private space. And we made it the most public space by creating seating in the area, and you could even look through the toilets. Of course, you couldn't use them, but okay. So finally, to end the presentation, so these are a few other projects that I've worked on, but I'm not really going to get into any of them. What I wanted to wrap up with is the fact that it's important to understand how to use different means of representation. And one way to do it is to copy styles, but not the content, but really the style and the means of representation an architect or artist uses to convey certain messages. And in order to understand this, you can get into the basics and context of the piece, and you can actually physically break down what it comprises, the actual components of it. And that's really helped me over these projects. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was really insightful and interesting. So now we are going to have a panel discussion, which is going to be moderated by architect MEERA VASUDEV. She did her bachelor's degree at RV College of Architecture, Bangalore, and master's in architecture at the University of Delft, the Netherlands. MEERA VASUDEV, with over 15 years of experience in critically understanding city architecture and placemaking that has roots in her academic research. The hybrid playground was part of the Border Conditions Studio and explored interstitial conditions of conflict, political, social, economic, cultural, using the realms of literature, philosophy, and art, cinema, and culture to critically explore creative responses to context and collaboration. This continues to inform her design processes as she runs a multidisciplinary design space studio, MEERA, that works at the intersection of art, culture, theory, and design. She has been a juror at several architecture schools in Karnataka and has also been teaching design at RV College of Architecture, Bangalore for the past 8 years, where students are encouraged to learn critical thinking and design through a cross-disciplinary lens. Thank you, ma'am. I hand over the session to you.
Thank you, Anisha. Thank you to all three of you, Padmavati, Sunil, and Neeti. That was really, really insightful. I think I want to start with talking about memory that Padmavati you spoke about, and the timelessness of memory. And Orhan Pamuk spoke about memory and beauty being interchangeable. Someone asked him if he remembered something because it related to his memory, and he said, no, I remember it because it was beautiful. So my first question would be, are beauty and memory two different things? And where does the act of forgetting come into play? Because if we talk about memory and beauty being things that are interchangeable, the idea of nostalgia actually comes from the idea of sadness. So where does the act of forgetting come into the entire idea of a story?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah? Right. I'd like to explain this with a play that we did in 2007. It was a play for children, and it was called The First Leaf. It was written by Srirang Godbole. And we were talking of the year 2020 in this play. And I'm telling you, while I'm talking to you, I have goosebumps now, because we were questioning the idea of beauty at that point of time. We were questioning our memory. We were questioning all that we had forgotten. It was a simple story for children about a tree having been cut down and how these children were trying to revive the tree, and they were being opposed by the person who owned the property, which was to be redeveloped as a complex. And in the play, I had designed, actually, I must thank NEETI for talking of that space for the confessions of the architects, you know, where they confess their environmental sins. I have one confession. So I had designed a set where everything was askew, especially in the house of the protagonists and their parents, because the protagonists are this boy and this girl, brother and sister, and their parental home. And all the furniture, you know, the sofas were benches which were like this. So you had to sit, your bum would be here, and your back would be reclining, and your legs would be like that. And so all the furniture also had these skewed lines. And horror of horrors, in 2010, in my own friend's home, I saw furniture with askew lines and walls that were slightly, you know, askew. And I was like, how do you live in this? I mean, that was, you know, it was designed to actually ridicule the way in which our idea of beauty was evolving, and how we were forgetting that form and function are linked. They need to be linked. You can't delineate them, right? And when you do that, then when you've separated forgetting from memory, then there's a problem. I think we need to remember what we are forgetting. We might forget. Yes, we might forget, but we don't have Alzheimer's, right? So we need to sort of come back. We forget momentarily, or we forget for short spells of time, or for long spells of time. But we need to look at how we can get that forgetting to be brought back into the realm of memory. And I think that's very important. And I think that was what we were trying to do with that play. And in that play, we were wearing, all the children, that the pollution levels hit such a high that everyone's wearing masks. And I can't tell you the power of especially, I think, writers, thinkers, creative people are able to see things. You know, I think all of us are creative. We just don't allow ourselves to be so. We tell ourselves a different story. And I think the story we need to tell ourselves and remind ourselves of is that we are creative souls in the first place. Because what we think and create in the mind then also manifests in reality. I believe that. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, it takes me to this Joseph Brodsky quote, which says, "In the end, all that you remember will not come to your aid, and what you have forgotten will be your best friend." So, and I mean, you know, it's interesting that all three of you spoke about the idea of memory at sort of varying, you know, levels. So, NEETI and Sunil, I mean, I don't know if you have anything to add, because what I would also like to ask is, how does architecture then act, you know, as a catalyst for storytelling, and how do we tell appropriate stories? At the same time, I also invite anybody in, you know, who would like to add to this discussion and participate with their thoughts.
Yes, I'd really love that if, people who are watching actually join in.
Yeah, I hope you take up MEERA and Padmavati on their invitation, because that was part of the format for this particular event session, especially. We thought stories, everyone has stories, and the more we share, the more we learn, and we find out how much we have in common, I guess. So,
Exactly.
yeah, please do participate.
Are Sunil and Neeti taking that up? Otherwise, I have something to add.
Please.
I just touched upon, I spoke about this copper pipe in the middle of a house, and I didn't elaborate on it. I was hoping to leave that open for someone to ask about it. It was a beautiful thing, which had a very solid function, and that was to collect the water from the roof, and the water got purified and filtered, came through these copper pipes, and then went back into the fields, and I said, now this wisdom and this, this marriage of form and function seems to have been lost. I mean, there's a divorce that's happened here, and we need to get the two together. And or we need to look at what was there in our traditions, which is worth keeping, And I really liked what Neeti said about, she was talking about rewriting the cultural narrative through architecture. And I think we really need to do that. We need to bring in what is still relevant. There are many things that are still relevant. There are many things in the knowledge systems which are getting lost, which need to be brought back and revived, and not wait for sanction from the Western world. I think we've constantly validated ourselves only when we've been validated from the outside. I think it's very important that we also look at what we would like to value.
Very true.
And look at what's worth valuing and revisit it all.
True. On that note, I have a question for Neeti as well, because you're talking about, her representation of cultural issues. And, Neeti, I was wondering this sort of use of poetic narratives, and, how does that become a medium then for these, social and cultural issues that you speak about? And how does the narrative itself become a character? It ceases to be something that is telling a story, but becomes part of the story itself. So, what does that mean as far as that sort of transformation between different mediums goes?
I think very specifically in written narratives, through the books that I've read, a lot of this is narratives itself are very layered, almost as if you can read the same text in a number of different ways. And I think using that aspect really helps you take a single strand out, something that you may personally connect with, and tell the exact same tale in an entirely different way. So I think very specifically, the book Invisible Libraries is something that stuck with me, because it was a book that I referenced in college for my thesis. And while it does exactly the same thing as Invisible Cities, it's interesting because I connected to the narrative on the level of someone who really enjoys reading. It became something of a personal space for me. And that itself creates a lot of layers to the narrative, because I myself, as I'm reading it with my social background, I'm connecting it to things that have happened in my life, but I'm also trying to read the same story from the background of the author. I'm trying to read it from their cultural background, their context. And I think a lot of this adds up at the end, because I think a lot of people have said what we are still trying to say. And the same words can mean 100 different things. So especially in the zine that I made on, which was called The Shrine for the Menstruator, I think rereading the same Bollywood movies that I was fond of, and reading it from, well, how women are portrayed in media, really changed how I viewed it.
That's really interesting because, both of you spoke about, Padmavati, you spoke about the copper pipe, and I think Neeti, a lot of this idea of menstruation and all comes from sort of folklore, the idea of superstition. And, it takes me to this beautiful book by A.K. Ramanujam about the folk stories of India, where he talks about a folk tale as, being a traveling metaphor, where it finds new meaning with each telling. And, Yuval Harari also spoke about the idea of gossip, where he spoke about stories that propagated with this idea of gossip, and gossip became sort of our first act of telling stories with, the idea of nuance. And Padmavati, you spoke about the idea of truth as well, and gossip sort of is that fine line between the two. So I would, also like to bring Sunil in at this point. Sunil, are you there? Because as he said, he stepped out for a bit.
Oh, I'm back. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
I missed a good chunk of it. So.
Well, okay, we were talking about, the idea of memory. And so at this point, we're talking about the idea of folklore and superstition. And my question would be to you in terms of how does, architecture act as this catalyst for storytelling? And, when we're talking about the idea of gossip and, does this act of storytelling change with each medium?
Okay, when you say medium,
because the three of you spoke about three different methods of storytelling. So do you think there is something that comes in with the idea of memory? And, again, going back to what both Padmavati and Neeti spoke about, where there is this interweaving of objects with memory, for the idea of remembrance.
Okay. And you're asking how does that come about with the medium I am practicing currently?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So the thing with what I am currently doing now, this was something that was planted a very long time ago. So it's not something that evolved when I just started the business in 2015. This basically came about because of the memories that I had with my father. So he would actually make a lot of things for me with his hands. When I would go to play school, he would create, he was a creator basically with his hands. So he would make a lot of these little houses, scale models. And it is those memories that kind of got imprinted into my subconscious. And I never remembered a lot of this actually. A lot of these memories came up as I was working on the designs for each of my individual models. And I was like, oh my God, where did this suddenly come up from? And then I remember this memory I had like 30 years ago, 33 years ago. So, and my dad was a documenter. So he kept a lot of notes that I did not see because he passed away when I was 9. So I did not see a lot of those documents until very recently. And in a lot of those notes, he was basically saying that I wish you would grow up to be a person that, like I am, a creator, a person who does stuff. And this came as a very shocking revelation. I mean, recently, because these are notes he made back in 1997 or something like that. So I would like to think that a lot of my childhood memories are basically buried into the models I make. So while it may not be apparent to the end user, I would like to think on some small level that my own personal memories are being diffused to the people who build my models. I'm not sure if I answered your question or if I even touched on it, but.
No, that's beautiful because I think while you were away, we spoke about this idea of forgetting. And the idea of nostalgia, because nostalgia is another way of, imbibing memory. But nostalgia is always spoken about as being, remembering with sadness, while Padmavati spoke about the idea of beauty and memory, which is sort of, a more positive take on this idea of remembering. So I don't know whether you were able to catch Neeti's
No,
presentation,
I
where
didn't.
she
Yeah,
speaks a lot about, the idea of, which is very interesting, where Neeti speaks about the idea of protest. So, and again, for me, that connects with Padmavati speaking of the truth and the idea of nuance. And here you are talking about, sort of these little, say, remnants, and objects of memory that you have been left behind with, that are sort of working within this larger idea of storytelling. So,
yeah.
I'd like to add a point here, that both with what Sunil just said, the memory of what his father, uh, the legacy he's inherited from his father, of the creator within, and what Neeti spoke about in terms of the shrine to the menstruator. Now, I think also this, sometimes the memory of pain gets embedded in our being, and that becomes the springboard for further creation, and I think that's really very important, because what is it that stays with us as a residue? What is it that lingers on, somewhere in the subconscious? I think those are very important start points, because if I look at, it's a simple thing like a gender issue. For example, women have been relegated to kitchens, to small, smoky, dark, ill-ventilated kitchens traditionally. And I think that's one thing from tradition I don't want to see replicated. I do want to see change there architecturally. Um, but yeah, so what is it that bothers you? What is it that um, spurs you on in terms of wanting to change something? I think that is also a source of great inspiration.
definitely, definitely. As much as we're talking about, uh, you know, going forward, we're always drawing from sort of stories of pain and stories of the past, which are definitely necessary to talk about the uncanny, talk about the negative, to talk about ideas of protest. So Anagha has a question. Anagha, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. This was a really nice session. Thank you for giving this opportunity. Now, just like Padmavati ma'am and Neeti ma'am spoke about how all of these things can be interpreted in many, many different ways based on how people see it, how do we make sure, or even if we could attempt to convey exactly what we want to convey?
Neeti, would you like to go before me? I'm happy to let you.
So I think at least one thing to keep in mind, what you want to say is never really what your audience is going to hear or see. They're always going to perceive it in whatever space they're in at that moment. And I think the best you can actually do is convey your story in a very specific perspective, one that really speaks to you, because that will definitely speak to people from different people from the same background. And another thing is, I think, at least in terms of form, even things like Instagram posts really hit hard. I think, of course, COVID really shut down a lot of protests across the world. And a lot of people were questioning what social media does in the role of protesting. And I think that's a very good question, because the way you consume your media is very important, especially in architecture, because a lot of advertisement for architecture comes up through social media. So I suppose there are different ways of addressing this question based on what exactly you want to say and how you want to say it, and staying true to the message of whatever you're making.
So I'd like to say that, I started working when I was very small, young. I did my first film when I was 15 with Girish Karnad as the director. And then we went on, when I was in my 20s, we made Malgudi Days. And so much later in life, in my 50s, I worked on Padmavat, and then I worked on Tanaji. So I have seen technology change. When we were making Malgudi Days, we were shooting on location. Everything was on location. I don't remember us hiring a studio floor ever for Malgudi. When it came to Padmavat, we were shooting on sets that were erected in Film City. When it came to Tanaji, we shot using technology. So most of the sets were created, of course, in the mind first, and then just, parts of them were created in the studio. And the rest was all done through computer graphics, most of it. And now, one is that technology is changing. We are all evolving. The economics of things will also decide. Now, in the middle of all this, you have your ideas, you have what you want to say, you have your beliefs, you have your inspiration, you have your aspirations. And you're never, at least I feel, we've never been able to predict with certainty, that people are going to receive it the way we offer it. So that will always be a gamble. And that's precisely what Steven Spielberg's quote was about, But there will be a common thread. There will be something common because the human spirit in some aspects is the same across the board, irrespective of what culture you hail from. And therefore, you will touch a certain chord. And therefore, it is very important that when I'm creating, I need to be in touch with that core of myself that feels the pain, that feels the joy, that feels. And at that point, the feeling becomes a space that I inhabit, And I think it's about creating that space of feeling, because we are taught right from our kindergarten, we are taught to think from here, right? And we're not taught to, we are actually taught how to suppress our feelings. We are trained for 10 years in school, then 2 years in pre-university, and then 5 years in college. We are trained not to follow our heart. We might talk about it, we say glorious things, but we are not able to back it and give youngsters the freedom that the human spirit demands. And I think we need to make that space. We need to make that space for that human spirit to be able to communicate from its core. And when that becomes possible, then the reception of it will also become possible in more or less the same spirit, despite whatever external influences are there. That seems to be the only way to me as an artist, as someone who does create things. That's the only thing I can swear by, that when I've worked on something from my heart, it does not fail to touch. Then the Rasanubhava, we were talking about the Rasanubhava before we began the session. And the Rasanubhava is that space where there is the meeting ground between the person who offers and the person who receives. And there is creation happening in the middle of all that, on the go. It's evolving. The moment is evolving. The time and space factors are evolving. And I think if one is in touch with that, then yes, the offering and the receiving find a common ground.
Beautiful. I'd just like to take a moment to introduce you to our principal who's here, Dr. Babne. And he had also a question. Sir, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? Sir, you're mute, so. Sir, we can't hear you. Okay, Sir says his audio has some issues, so I will ask on his behalf. Sir asks, how do we really perceive beauty? A theatre person and an architect may see it differently. So here, this I open to all three of you to answer.
Would you like to take that, Sunil or NEETI?
So my answer is going to be my own personal interpretation of it again. So I always thought my opinion of what is beautiful is more or less aligned with what everybody else would consider beautiful. But I found that to be quite different once I actually got married. And my wife joined me in my business and we started designing the different buildings together. So I would come up with a design that I thought was like magnificent. But she would say, I really don't like how that looks. So it's incredibly subjective. Like even among our users, there's a massive variation in what people like and don't like. And I feel it's largely what people are exposed to, the cultures they come from, the media they consume. So all of these things subtly affect their subconscious and their perception of what is beautiful. Yeah, that's my opinion on that.
NEETI, you have something to add as, an architectural perspective or, the idea of working with different medium?
I definitely agree with Sunil. Having read through different styles and periods in architecture, one questions what people were thinking at that point of time, because a lot of the architecture we see today, we consider ugly, and I'm sure a lot of the architecture that we are making today, we think doesn't look so nice. And I think it's the connection we have to beauty itself, and we relate to it in some way. And of course, there's beauty beyond what we see, right? So.
You done?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now for the other side of the coin.
I was reminded of the time when on Malgudi days, I had to draw the whole town of Malgudi. Now, Malgudi was imagined, right, by R.K. Narayan. And there was a drawing which was there in one of the books that we were referring to. And I had to reproduce that on a larger scale. And when I did that, the greatest joy I had was because all the structures were being drawn. I mean, I've not gone to architectural school or, I'm not a professional. So in that sense, but I was drawing it and I loved drawing those roofs. And there's a comment here, which I'd like to weave into the answer to the principle. Um, uh, it is from, I've lost the name, Anvesha Saha. Right, so this whole thing of those roofs and all of that, and that was one memory. The other, and the idea, I'm tying it up with the idea of beauty. The other was standing in, it was Geneva, and I was standing on this friend's house roof, and I was looking at all the roofs, and the roofs were sloping. I experienced the same thing when I went to Nuremberg and Dresden, and you know, there were these sloping roofs. There were tall buildings with sloping roofs, and again, I thought it was beautiful. The very buildings that I had detested, to put it very mildly, in Bombay, built by extremely reputed builders. And if I wasn't in the media, I would have taken names, but I will hold back. And they're very, very successful builders. But oh my God, there are elements, because it suits their idea of beauty. There will be these huge pillars. I don't know whether they're Greek or Roman or what, but they're supporting nothing, because it's their idea of beauty and they just shoved it in there into the structure. And I see that happening in a lot of places. Those pillars are holding nothing, right? Now, when the idea of beauty, again, I'm saying when it gets disconnected from the function, then there's a problem, right? And that's a dangerous thing to happen. Also, what is that idea of beauty that we want to make part of our samskara, of our sanskar? Yeah. What is that idea of beauty we want to make part of it? I think that's very a very, very vital point that is going to define the way we approach our professions, the way we practice them, the way we enhance the look of what we create. Yeah, so that it actually incorporates. Recently, I created a non-electric fridge, and it was done without cement and without sand, because sand is not allowed anymore. So I said, how do we create something that people can use without electricity? Now that may not be beautiful, but it becomes beautiful because there is something natural being used. So you don't need to beautify nature. Nature is beautiful. And I find that when I stick to what is natural, I don't need to beautify something consciously. There is an element of beauty already inherent in it, which I do not find with the synthetic. With synthetic, there is a lot of striving to actually create beauty. But when I stick closer to the natural, beauty emerges naturally as part of the process. I don't know if I've answered the question, but I've answered it from my heart.
I think Anvesha has a little story she'd like to add, I think, which would work with this idea of, you know, beauty and the natural that you're talking about. Anvesha?
Yes. So I just wanted to share an experience and ask a question to everyone, all the panelists. So I grew up in a small town with my cousins, and the idea of memory and how smaller architectural elements are like what it's related to one of the best memories in my life. But then I shifted to a city, and it has been really different. I've become more introverted, I would say, and due to this pandemic situation, it has actually increased And I'm not talking for myself as well. And this in pandemic situation has also impacted all of the students as well. So I wanted to ask, how should we actually put out ourselves in this situation of pandemic? That was what I wanted to ask.
I can. Does anyone want to go? I'm just very evoked and triggered with everything that's happening here. But if anyone wants to go first, I'll be happy to.
No, you can go ahead.
You know, the
that's okay.
first thing when you spoke, Anvesha, I was reminded of a song. I don't know how many people who understand Marathi are here, but Marathi happens to be my mother tongue. I inherited Kannada from my father. And but from my mother I got Marathi, and with that, this is a song which was written by the poet Bahina Bai, and she wove her poetry with everyday experiences. And one of the things was, it comes to me only if I sing it. Hare samsara samsara jasa tava चुल्ह्यावर आधी हाताला चटके मग मिळते भाकर हरे संसार. That's the song, and it says that you have to make that bhakari, and only when you burn your fingers can you feed, yourself. It's only when you feel that the heat of the tawa, and only when you've kneaded the dough and done what it takes to make that bhakri, only then can you have the experience of the bhakri. So there are no shortcuts, Anvesha. These are difficult times. What you can do is, and what each one of us can do, because I would be lying if I told you that my life is full of people. No, it's not. It is a lonely journey, and for creative people, it's even more so. But the one thing we can do is reach out, find your flock, and your flock doesn't have to be necessarily of your age. You might be well beyond your years, yeah, and someone may be young at heart. So this thing, because we also trained, we have been brought up for several years of our life. We've spent more hours in classrooms filled with people of the same age. We've done that to ourselves, and I have to admit that as a parent, yes, I did try to subscribe to other systems, but it happened to my children too, and I've been hoping that it will change. But in reality, the world is made up of people of different ages, and there's a wide variety you can choose from, and you'll find that we're more or less all in the same boat, and we can be a support unto each other. We can be an inspiration to each other. And so, yeah, just never ever tire of finding your flock. That's what I would say to you, Anvesha.
Thank you.
That reminds me of this quote by Rebecca Solnit, where she talks about the art of getting lost. And she says, the straight is not the line for joy. The crooked, meandering, lost line allows for joy. So thank you. I think Namrata has a question for Neeti. Namrata?
Yes. My question to NEETI ma'am would be, ma'am, talked about the shrine for the menstruator, and in that, what were your inspirations from the folklores and the stories? How did that inspire the architectural intervention?
So I think in every project, there's a starting point, and then it kind of gets into this never-ending rabbit hole of there is so much information around this. There are different perspectives, but in terms of some of the stories that I found relevant There's Devdutt Patnayak's interpretation of the Mahabharata and stories about Draupadi, the Palace of Illusions, telling it from her perspective. And then Raja Ravi Varma, I always found it strange that there are a large set of his paintings on women, dressed in a specific way. Of course, they would have been upper class women, portrayed in a certain way. And I always, I think that was Shakuntala, the series that I put in. But I think there is a very specific way that women are spoken about over the last many decades. And I think you can find a lot of text about the different interpretations. But if I'm not mistaken, that there's this theory. I'm not too sure of who said it, but they said if you can find a movie where there are two women, that's the first condition. The second is that they're not just plot devices relevant to the male lead. And the third is that they have a conversation about somebody other than a man. And what's very interesting is that most of the movies fail this. Most of our stories fail this. Most of our mythologies. And a lot of narratives around women are told in very strict ways of how society is supposed to view women. So I think a lot of the ideas that I had stemmed around the shame of menstruation and the woman's body. And I think that's how I started the whole thing. And then I got into the next layer, which is the stories about them. And then the next layer, which is, are there different perspectives about it? What is my perspective about it? What was my perspective about it before reading all of this? And that kind of helped me with this project specifically.
Thank you so much. I would now,
yeah. Padmavati, were you saying something? Or
No, I wasn't. But I read something that Anagha has put.
Yes,
something we could practice every day. I can tell you what I do. And I sort of had to develop the courage to stand by what I believed in. I had to develop the courage to admit to myself those truths I wouldn't dare. I had to find it in me to dare to defy also tradition in a way, because when I tried to meditate on the earth, because I felt that there was just too much happening, and we had goofed up. My generation has goofed up big time. So did my parents' generation. And I'm saying we can't hand the earth to a younger generation in the state that it is in. And I was looking at shlokas that I would find peace in. And I didn't want shlokas that were, either only oriented towards a certain gender, whether male or female, or whether the union of the two. So I decided I would create my own. And I created a 36-line, I don't know what to call it. It's like a verse to the mother goddess, to the earth. And that has helped me. So sometimes you may not find ready-made solutions. Why I share this is just to say that there may not be a ready-made solution tailored for you, for your beliefs, or for the way you are evolving, right? And you might need to create your own. And to at least begin, to make a beginning. and to also allow for incompleteness and imperfection into one's life. We want everything to be perfect. We want everything to be right. We want everything to be complete. And nothing is so even in nature. It's all evolving. So can I also allow myself that? I think that is what I would invite you to say to yourself, and to allow yourself to give yourself that every day, to allow yourself a new freedom.
Thank you for that, Padmavati. That was really beautiful. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think we can actually go on and on.
It's been really lovely to be here. I have to say, it's been extremely evocative for me.
I just have a quick question. First of all, thanks for those amazing, deep, beautiful presentations, very diverse presentations, and thank you very much. So I come from a discipline that's very rational, supposedly rational, planning, urban planning. And so there's been a lot of research about the role of storytelling in, making rational decisions. And there's this inherent contradiction seen there, because there are as many stories as there are people in the world. And each person might have multiple stories and realities and truths as well, right? So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, all three speakers, on how does one then, because the storyteller is very powerful as well, right? Because a very powerful individual, it's their version that one gets to hear then. So in planning, then there's this thing where we want multiple voices to be heard, multiple stories to be heard. So any decisions that get made are fair and just, and as to as many people as possible, if not everyone. Any thoughts on how a storyteller can position themselves in the scheme of the real world, and as a real world, as what I mean, the planning world, I guess, where rational decisions need to be made by policymakers, and people in governance and all. Yeah.
I have a story to tell you. It was 1995. I was making a film called Women Fast Forward with the women of Video Seva, Ahmedabad. And this film may be available on the net. I'm not too sure. If I remember right, it was produced by North South Productions. It was shown as part of a video magazine called People and the Planet. And I think it showed in 91 countries around the world. During the course of that filming, we discovered that Video Seva, they were encouraging their women members to actually make a film. And they took, now these were women who were illiterate. They were women who learned how to sign their name overnight to create their own bank. That bank had no debts, no bad debts. Okay, if you gave a woman a loan, it always came back. She had to be dead for it not to be returned, right? These were women who were stitching old clothes, mending them, selling them in markets. They were sitting in a chowk called Manik Chowk, and they were being ousted from Manik Chowk so that they could have, broaden the roads and whatever. Urban planning had not taken into consideration the traditional marketing system in Ahmedabad. And these women, they didn't know how to fight their case. They'd been sitting there for 50 years on those roads and those streets, marketing their wares, selling their stuff, selling groceries, selling vegetables, selling old clothes, mended clothes, and they didn't know where to go. And they made a film. They told the story, and they told the story that was unfolding in the here and now for them. That film became a landmark film about police atrocities. That film became their advocate. that film spoke more for them without ever getting corrupted. You know, corruption is a big thing, and it can just take even your children away from you. And this is what happened. They fought the case with that film. They went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court acknowledged that public, when public policy is being created on urban planning and stuff like that, the traditional marketing systems have to be taken into consideration. That was the ruling passed by the Supreme Court with that film, that these illiterate women made, women who didn't know how to operate a camera. They could not read play, eject, record. They couldn't read those words, but the symbols, they remembered them as designs, right? And they learned filmmaking and they made it. And so, that is something, if we are willing to tell our story, if we are willing to tell the story that we feel passionately about, I think that's what's going to matter.
Thanks, Padmavati. Sunil, Neeti, would you like to add? Oh, sorry, Meera, yeah.
No, sorry, go on, Salila.
No, I didn't know if they wanted to add something to that. I guess not. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I think perspective is really important. And at least through college, we were taught that, like the architect's role is one that you see in bird's eye view, which actually puts the architect on a pedestal. And you can kind of see that with the architects that are very famous, that we admire, because one doesn't really question how these architects have gotten where they are. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is once you delve into an issue, it's very important to be sensitive and respect all perspectives. Understand that there are probably more than just yours, and kind of do the best you can, especially on issues related to climate and issues related to respecting others and things like that. I think especially in the means of protesting, the idea is visibility and representation. And both are equally important, but one cannot happen without the other. If you're yelling about something that is about maybe the 1% of the population, no one's really going to care. But if it's a collective voice and it's representative of a perspective that stems across class or gender issues, I think those are a few things to keep in mind.
Thanks, Neeti. Love the answer.
I think we have one last question from Anil sir. Anil sir, would you like to ask your question?
Anil?
Are you here?
Yeah, I guess Meera, you can go ahead.
I think I will ask.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah, please.
I had to leave for a call, so another call. Okay. No, it was just I think I was looking at Neeti's one of the segment when she had shown some comic strips. I was wondering whether she had also drawn something part of her narrative, or it was just a reference thing that she had taken. That was all. It was just an observation, nothing more.
I'm sorry, do you mean that, or are you referencing the images that I showed before my actual comic strip, or?
No, in the comic strip segment, you had architecture and the comic strip, and you had shown something on Superman, and there was something else about an urban situation. The graphic artist draws that kind of narrator. So no, I was just wondering whether you had put anything of your own as an architect.
So the next segment, I mean, the next slide after that was actually a work that I had recently written and drawn out. And I think during that process, I mean, you saw the images, but they weren't exactly as powerful as I had in my head. And of course, this is because I've read like a lot of comics and I'm hoping to get to that level. But I think in the images that I showed, I wanted to convey the stage that I had in making this comic, which was the fact that, well, one, since there are different kinds of stories, two, there have to be different ways of telling it. And even within comics itself, how you approach it, just the line weight and the textures and the colors that you use really hit hard with relation to the text that you're trying to, convey. And with mine, I think all I could do was create line drawings that were relevant as well as layer on texture and spaces that I thought would create a sort of heavy atmosphere within the frame itself.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know if that answered your question, but.
So yeah, no, it was just an observation. I found it pretty interesting since I have an interest in comic book making. So
Padmavati, Anil Achar is one of our senior colleagues, and he's very well known for his caricatures and sense of humor and all that good stuff. So.
I think when you took our semester out, our whole class hunted and found your comic strips. They're amazing.
Yeah, it was years ago, right? Anyway, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you, Anand. I think Padmavati is talking about also watching a film called Manufacturing Consent to sort of go hand in hand with what Neeti was talking about, with the idea of protest and.
Actually, I think that's really interesting because propaganda, government propaganda especially, sometimes is very beautiful. And you find yourself getting sucked into that overall narrative that they tell you is good for you. So I do get that. Even in protests, it may look like one thing, but it actually is something else entirely. Like, I think the black squares that came up after Black Lives Matter, that I think was put up across the world, but I did read a lot about questioning it as a form of protest at all. So that's really interesting.
Thank you, Neeti. I think we're almost out of time for today.
Yeah.
So, Shweta and Salila, I think.
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to wind up.
Yeah, absolutely. We've already surpassed 8, and I'm sure I'm getting hungry.
Dinner time. So, are Namrata and Anvisha going to wrap this up?
Yes, ma'am. So we'd like to invite the principal, Dr. O.P. Bhavani, to say a few words.
I think Sir doesn't have audio that is working, but he said he can hear.
And I think he's also put up a note on his behalf.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just read it out. So Sir wants to thank Ms. Padmavati and the alumni, Neeti ma'am and Sunil sir, for being here today and for being a part of this wonderful session, which is very informative and very enjoyable. So thank you. So we'd also like to thank the student coordinators and the teachers for being a part of this Crossroads of Conversation. So this was our last session for this edition. So we would be coming back next semester for this, and so the student coordinators are Niharika, Alankrita, Anvesha, and Gautam, Sujay, and I would like to thank Sujay especially for creating the posters for this event, and the teachers who helped us are Shweta ma'am, Anuradha ma'am, Salila ma'am, and also Anuradha ma'am. So thank you, teachers, for creating this wonderful opportunity. We would also like to thank the trust, RSS Trust, and our Dean, Professor Suresh Murthy. And thank you all for being here today. This session was of the entire process of conversation was very informative. It covered topics from politics of space, performance, and feminist perspectives, crafting spaces in the digital realm, tracing narratives, and we had an amazing array of speakers from various allied fields as well as from architecture. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Padmavati. Thanks, Neeti and Sunil as well. It was really lovely having you, and we look forward to continuing our conversations and collaborating as we plan to.
Barely scratched the surface. So thank you to all three of you.
Thank you so much.
Extremely provocative session.
Thank you. Thank you to the principal as well. I think he has been a huge support in conducting these series. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, and thank you to all the speakers today. I think it was just a wonderful session. I'm sure we have a lot of takeaways, from this. And of course, thank you to the wonderful team of students who've been constantly helping us out with all the logistics. Yeah, so thank you. And thank you, MEERA. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, MEERA. Yeah, absolutely beautifully done. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you to all the participants as well.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.